Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Thank you especially to Jennifer, who set all this up, and for her constant support of our wines. So today, we're going to talk about the project of which I'm the managing partner, a project called Clos Pissarra. And it's a project, well, we're going to be, which is based in Catalonia, the province of which Barcelona is the capital. But we're going to be tasting wines from there and one wine from somewhere completely different, also in Spain, but from a completely different part of Spain. So before we begin, I have a map of Spain behind me that I hope you can see. So this is Spain, and as you can see, all these areas that are colored are vineyards throughout the country. So Spain has 3.6 million acres of vineyards, more than any other country in the world. Although it's not the largest producer of wine, that honor goes to Italy, followed by France, and then Spain. But to give you a comparison of the size of the amount of vineyards, California, which is the fourth largest producer in the world, only has 600,000 acres. So a sixth of what is planted in Spain in a territory of about equivalent size. So I'm going to give you a history lesson first. So you're going to know more about Spain than you'll ever thought you wanted to know. But it was the Phoenicians who came from a region encompassing modern-day Israel, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, a region formerly called Canaan, and whose territory extended throughout the Mediterranean, that around the year 1100 before Christ, founded the city of Gadir. Gadir is what we know as Cadiz on the Andalusian coast in the south of Spain, and introduced viticulture in Spain. Many of the genetic ancestors of the modern Spanish varieties were brought by this great maritime culture, although primitive grape cultivation in the country dates back thousands of years before that. But perhaps no country in the world has increased the quality of its wines in the last 30 years as much as Spain. The death of the dictator Generalissimo Francisco Franco, who ruled Spain between 1936 till his death in 1975, and then the entry shortly thereafter of Spain into the European Common Market, today known as the European Union, awakened a whole new generation of young men and women who took on the challenge of modernizing the Spanish wine landscape. In Spain, we have the denominación de origen, or appellation of origin, which is similar to our AVAs, our American viticultural areas. For example, Napa Valley being the best known AVA. So Spain has the DO, or Denominación de Origen, and then they have one other category above that called Denominación de Origen Calificada, which translates to qualified appellation of origin, which is even higher and has only been granted to two wine regions, Rioja and Priorato, which we're going to be talking about. So our winery, well, to start, how I got, well, into this mess to begin with. So I was a som for many years with the Ritz-Carlton from 99, no, I'm sorry, from 88, first in Laguna Niguel to the year 2000, finishing up in San Francisco. And in the mid 90s, I decided with some friends to make wine first as a new challenge, and which ended up becoming a new career. So I was the first sommelier in the country to commercially start making wine. And I started with a project in California called Mura, which we're going to be visiting in a couple of weeks. Mura mostly centered around Pinot Noir in various areas of California. But after I got Mura going in the late 90s, I decided I wanted to do something in Spain because I grew up in Spain of a Spanish mother, and it was an uncle in Madrid who got me hooked on wine. So to honor my heritage and my uncle, I decided to explore the possibility of doing something in Spain. And I spent a couple of years running around to the main wine regions, Rioja, Ribera del Duero, some of the better known ones, and came to the conclusion that the most exciting place to start a new project were these two tiny regions in Catalonia, Priorat and Montsant. And so I'm going to give you a little background because most of us are not familiar with these two regions, which have become quite prominent on the Spanish landscape today. So if it was the Phoenicians who first promoted grape plantations in the south of Spain, in Andalusia, it was the Romans about 1,000 years afterwards, about 2,000 years ago, who introduced the vine to the north of Hispania, what they called Spain. And it must be assumed that the first plantations would be near Tarraco, nowadays called Tarragona, since this city was the capital of the Roman Empire in Spain, and actually several Roman emperors were even born in Tarraco. So 25 miles east of Tarragona, or Tarraco, and about 80 miles southwest of Barcelona, we find the Priorat Valley surrounded by the Montsant Mountains at a height of about 2,300 feet above sea level. It was in the 12th century when some Carthusian monks who had been exiled from France, and according to legend, as they were walking through this valley, they met a shepherd who told them how angels rose and fell from a gigantic pine, or another legend, how they came across a group of cats that started dancing in front of them. I get the feeling that perhaps they had a little bit too much to drink on that particular day. But it was a spot where they decided to build a huge monastery that they called Scala Dei, which in Latin means stairway to God. And thus they existed promoting viticulture, hence the name Priorat coming from priory, from the influence of these monks. And like I said, they promoted viticulture until about 1842, when the state appropriated a large part of their holdings and gave it to the local farmers. From that point begins the decline in quality of the wines, added by the advent of several natural and man-made disasters, starting with phylloxera in the 1860s. So phylloxera is a root louse which devastated all of Europe's vineyards. So you have to imagine that beginning in the late 1860s and finishing up around 1900, most all of Europe's vineyards were devastated by this root louse that actually is native to the United States and got introduced into Europe because somebody took some plants infected with this root louse to the botanical gardens in London, and from there it spread onto into Europe and decimated Europe's vineyards. It was actually a Texan, a horticulturalist called Thomas Munson, that came up with the concept of grafting European vines onto American rootstocks, which were resistant to this root louse. So today, most all the vineyards in the world are planted in this way. So you have Cabernet vines, for example, Cabernet or Pinot, Chardonnay, which are grafted on Native American vines. So vines like Concord or Catawba, things that don't make very good wine, make good jelly, but not very good wine. And with the exception of the one country which still has its own vines planted on its own rootstocks is Chile, because Chile has that natural protection in the north from the Atacama Desert, the driest place on earth, to the southern part, protected by Antarctica, to the eastern part, the Andes, and the western part, Pacific Ocean. So Chile, to this day, has some of the strictest quarantine laws in the world, because of course, if phylloxera were to be introduced to Chile, it would have a devastating effect on those vineyards. So that started the precipice of much of the wine industry in Europe. Obviously, then you had the world wars, World War I and World War II, and especially for Spain, the Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 1939, where 500,000 people, or 20% of the entire population of Spain, lost their lives. The modern revival after Franco died of this region really began in 1979, when a gentleman by the name of René Barbier, who is the owner nowadays of a winery called Clos Morgador, at that time a winemaker in Rioja, he was a winemaker in Rioja for the Alvaro Palacios family, discovers these dramatic vineyards of old vines made up of Grenache and Carignan, planted on extremely steep slopes where basically the whole landscape is covered in slate, and convinces a group of his friends to make wine there. Finally, in 1989, René Barbier with Alvaro Palacios, who nowadays makes Spain's most expensive wine, La Ermita, costs about $750 a bottle for a current vintage. Carlos Pastrana and Jose Luis Perez, and a Swiss-American lady, Daphne Dorian, of Clos Erasmus, started this project in this region that more or less had been abandoned. So from 1989 to 1991, they make the same wine, but under 5 different labels before they started on their own projects. To give you an idea, if you were visiting Barcelona around 1990 and you went to the house, you were invited to the house of a major wine collector in Barcelona, and you said, "Have you heard of this wine, Priorat?" He'd say, "Nah," and 80 miles away. And then he might say, wait, don't they make that strange wine that they call Vino Rancio? Vino Rancio translates to rancid wine. And Vino Rancio, it was traditionally made in the region by harvesting Grenache and Carignan, making it like red wine, but then sticking that wine in these big glass jars that we call demijohns, which hold about 5 gallons of wine, sticking a cork and putting these glass jars on rooftops. So guess what happens when you stick a glass jar full of wine on a rooftop? Well, it oxidizes. It was their version of a sherry-like wine. I might add, not a very good version of sherry. I always say that there's only two kinds of people that drank Vino Rancio: the guys that made it and their mothers. So back then, that was the main style of wine in the region, drank locally. In fact, I met a Dutchman in the mid-90s, a gentleman called Hubert Juisker, who in 1992 wrote the Wine Atlas of Spain, that at that time was the most complete work about Spanish wines. The book has about 240 pages, and less than a quarter of a page was dedicated to Priorat. This is in 1992. So this region pretty much had been obliterated from the wine map. It was only in the late 1990s when the British press got a hold of the wines that these four young men and this one young lady had started making, and started talking about this incredible wine of incredible intensity and power, yet still very elegant. Then Robert Parker, the famous American critic, started giving them crazy scores, 100 points right and left. And finally, Spanish wine writers started to discover the region, because in Spain, we're always the last ones to realize when we do anything well. So today, Priorat wines are the most expensive and sought after wines in all of Spain. Think of it as Spain's Napa Valley. And Montsant, that surrounds it, and we'll talk a little bit more about Montsant in a moment, is kind of like Sonoma County, although my Sonoma friends don't really appreciate that reference. Kind of poor man's Priorat, often nicknamed that way. In 1970, only about 10% of all the wine made in Priorat was bottled. The rest was sold in bulk, in co-ops, to locals that would fill up their big glass demijohns and take them home and drink them at home. At that time, there were about 2,000 acres of vines and less than 20 producers. So today, 100% of the wine is bottled. And from 2,000 acres of vineyards, today we have 5,000 acres and over 100 wineries. 96% of the wine produced in this region is red, mostly Grenache and Carignan, although Cabernet, Merlot, and Syrah are also allowed and were introduced by the 5 winemakers that I mentioned before, as many of them had apprenticed in France and thought that these varieties would do well there. Only 4% of the wine in the area is white, and mostly from grapes that we're not very familiar with, white Grenache, Macabeo, and Pedro Jimenez. Within the Valley of Priorat, so within this Valley of Priorat, you have 2 appellations, Priorat and Montsant. Priorat, like I mentioned before, became the second qualified appellation of origin in Spain after Rioja, and Montsant became its own appellation in 2002. The difference between Priorat and Montsant is Priorat in the middle of this valley is on very steep mountains. Montsant surrounds it almost entirely like a horseshoe, has about the same amount of vineyards, about 5,000 acres of vineyards. And it's hilly, but nowhere near as steep. And the soil has that same slate that Priorat is so well known for, but here it's also mixed in with clay. So in English, that means that the soil is more fertile. The wines are more fruity and can be drunk younger, but they don't have the intensity or complexity of the best Priorats. Although in general, Montsants are often much more affordable than Priorat. So today we're going to start off with a wine from Galicia. So Galicia which is, I'm going to go back to my map. Galicia is this province right here that sits right above Portugal. And this area here, we might see in green where I'm pointing, that's called the Rias Baixas, or lower rivers. So why do we make this wine? The first, I'll show you a picture, the Arrels Albarino. Why do we make an Albarino from Galicia? Albarino is considered Spain's greatest white wine grape, and has become quite popular with somms around the country. But going back to why the reason that we make a wine from a place that's about 350 miles away from where our winery is because my winemaker, Marucha Roel, comes from Galicia. And if you've ever been around anyone from Galicia, they think that the world revolves around Albarino. There is no finer grape in the world to somebody from Galicia than Albarino. And Marucha would always bemoan the fact that she had met a Catalan, got married, and had moved to Catalonia and was not able to make wine from the world's greatest white wine grape. So I got tired of listening to her. And one day I said, look, your family has a small vineyard of Albarino. Why don't we get the grapes and bring them over to the winery like we do in California, transport them in a refrigerated truck, and then make the wine there. And so we started doing that. We started doing that in about 2012. We only make about 150 cases of this a year. So this is, if you've been in Spain, the best seafood in Spain, and many would say anywhere in the world, comes from the coast of Galicia. So amazing lobsters, razor clams, all kinds of various shrimp, fish come from this region. And the typical wine that is served is an Albarino. Albarino is a wine that typically it's a lighter body, but very crisp, lots of kind of lemon and peach notes, but with very high acid. So with very strong seafood flavors like oysters or clams, it's kind of the perfect wine to kind of refresh your palate before the next morsel. So hence the reason why we make a wine from Galicia, even though we're nowhere near there. So, but now going back, as I imagine you're all tasting it, you can get the idea of why this really lighter, crisp, really refreshing style of wine has become very popular, not only in Spain, but throughout. Somebody's showing me a picture. No, but throughout many great restaurants throughout the United States serve an Albarino. It's something that has become kind of a phenomenon and probably the best known white wine from Spain. But now we're going to go to Montsant and we're going to try. So first, how I got started in 2003 I was having lunch in a restaurant, one of my favorite restaurants in the country, a restaurant called Pissarra that's owned by a Basque friend called Gerald Hirigoyen, James Beard nominee for Best California Chef. I was at his restaurant at a wine tasting, and the wine tasting finished, and I was walking outside, and there was Gerald with another French chef, good friend of mine also, Laurent Manrique, who at that time was the chef of Aqua, which was a 2-star Michelin restaurant in San Francisco, the highest Michelin star restaurant in San Francisco at that time. And we sat, they invited me to sit down and join them for a glass of wine. And so we were chatting around. And this was in June of 2003. And he said, well, what are your plans for this summer? I said, well, I'm leaving on a plane tomorrow to go to Catalonia because I'm looking to buy a vineyard there and start a project there. And they looked at me and they said, we want to be a part of that. And asked me, well, how much is this going to cost to do? And I told them. They both took out their checkbooks and wrote me a check on the spot. And then we said, well, we better tell another friend of ours, another chef friend, Sylvain Portet. And I had worked with Sylvain at the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco. And Sylvain had been the chef de cuisine for Alain Ducasse when he first got 3 Michelin stars at Louis Quinze in Monte Carlo, and had been the exec chef of Le Cirque in New York before coming to work in San Francisco. And we became good friends. I said, well, if we don't tell Sylvain about this, he's going to be really pissed off at us. So we called Sylvain and we said, look, we're doing this, so if you want to be a part of it. And he says, where can I meet you and give you a check? So that summer, I went and we bought a 6-acre vineyard in Priorat that was planted 100% to Grenache. And I'll tell you something, a note of caution. If you ever want to do a project with 3 very well-known French chefs, please be aware that they are not the easiest people to work with. It took 6 months just to agree on the name for the project. But no, they bring a lot of passion and commitment to the project. Arrels means roots of a vine in Catalan. Catalan being the language of Catalonia, a language that's a mixture of Old French and Old Spanish. And so we bought this 6-acre vineyard and started making wine in 2003. We make about, and this is 100% Grenache, make about 450 cases a year of this wine. And it's all aged in French barrels, French oak barrels for about a year. All the vineyards that we have in Priorat are organically farmed. We don't filter the wines. So I try to be very true to the place where these vineyards, where these wines come from. I like to say that wine passes through our hands without having too much of our imprint on it. The idea is to encapsulate what I think is a special place. So you'll see that Grenache here in its pure state is an incredibly aromatic wine. It reminds me a lot of Pinot Noir in terms of that beautiful perfume, a lot of red fruit, a lot of strawberries, red cherries, red plums. It doesn't have that velvety body of Pinot, but it also has that that acidity and brightness that Pinot has. So a lot of us Somms feel that Grenache alongside Pinot Noir is probably one of the most wine-friendly grapes that there is. And this is a wine that is typically served with all kinds of poultry, from chicken to duck to goose, pheasant, quail, but can also work well with fish like salmon or tuna, especially tuna, which has a red meat type of consistency to it. So it's of all the wines I make, I probably drink more Arrels than any other wine, whether it be from California or Spain. So that's Arels. Then we're going to move on to the Clos Pissarra El Monte. So Clos Pissarra. So after I started the project, after I started the Arels project, a number of friends found out and wanted to be a part of it. People that don't have anything to do with the wine world. So we created the name Clos Pissarra for that project and started buying more vineyards, not only in Montsant, where Arels was located, but also in Priorat. So Clos Pissarra, Clos, the French would pronounce it Clos. I mentioned that Catalan was a mixture of French and Spanish. Well, you'll recognize the word Clos from a number of Burgundy vineyards. So Clos or Clos, like a Catalan would say, is a single or walled vineyard, and Pissarra is the Catalan word for slate. So today we have about 25 acres of vineyards in Montsant and about 35 acres of vineyards in Priorat. A few years later, we built our own winery, hence why I have so much gray hair. It took us 5 years to do and a lot of bureaucratic mess to go through. And we do a number of different bottlings, but El Monte is one of my favorite ones because it was also a life lesson. So this vineyard is also 100% Grenache. Now, most of the wines in both Priorat and Montsant are blends. Like I mentioned, primarily Grenache and Carignan, although Cabernet, Merlot, and Syrah are allowed. So unusual to have a wine from Montsant or Priorat that's 100% Grenache. So I'll tell you an amusing story about this vineyard. In 2007, we had bought a vineyard in 2005 in Priorat from vines that were over 130 years old. And it made, and it still makes, spectacular wine. But we only make like about 50 cases of that wine. So next to that vineyard was a large parcel of the same slope, same soil, but had never been planted. It was wild forest. And so I talked to my vineyard manager. I said, you know what? I'd like to buy that land and plant it because obviously it has the potential to make incredible wine because we had seen it from the vineyard that we already had. And he found out the gentleman who was an older gentleman that owned this vineyard. And we went to visit him in his house in this little village of about 200 people. And I said, sir, you know, I have the vineyard right next to your land, and I'd like to buy those 2 parcels that you own right next to my vineyard. And he says, sure. He says, but I have this other vineyard about 300 yards away at the base of this monolithic mountain. I said, no. I know that vineyard's yours, but I'm not interested in vineyard. That vineyard was not one bit of the typical state that I wasn't interested in. And no, I just want those 2 unplanted parcels. And he says, well, I'll sell it. I'll never be able to get it unless I sell it with the parcel. And so it was a vineyard was about 2.
Emmanuel, you're frozen at the moment.
Sun went off.
And I paid $5,000 for it.
I don't know if you, Emmanuel, can you hear me?
So not very much, but it's like, I'm sorry,
Emmanuel,
can you hear me now?
yeah, I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Frozen. Yeah, now it's better. You were a little bit
Can you
muffled.
hear me?
Oh,
You lost
no.
him.
We're going to try getting him back on. Hold on for 1 second. Not yet. Marty, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I am well.
How is your daughter?
She's much better. Thank you for asking.
Is she good?
Yeah, she just actually came yesterday, so she's a
Oh, fabulous.
grandkids are good. Your grandkids are good.
My grandkids are great, but I don't see them. We're all in quarantine. We don't leave the house.
How's Bonnie? Bonnie's good.
Yeah, Bonnie's great.
Good. Good. Oh, here we go. Let me get him in. Oh, you will.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah,
Back.
Okay.
That's the Puerto Rico electrical company for you. Anyway, where did I lose you?
The purchase of the wine with the gentleman.
With the purchase?
The
So-
purchase, you were just, you were talking to him and he said, sure, but I have,
This other vineyard. Okay, so I have this other vineyard, and I said, look, I'm not interested in that other vineyard. I just want those 2 unplanted parcels. And he says, I'll sell it to you really cheap. And I said, no, it's fine. I'm not interested in that. And he says, look, I'll never be able to sell that vineyard because it was all on volcanic rock and clay, not one bit of the famous slate soils that the region is known for. And he says, I'll never be able to sell that vineyard unless I sell it with those parcels. So I ended up paying $5,000 for a 2.5 acre vineyard. So you say, well, that's not very much. But for me, it was going to be a pain in my side because now we had a vineyard that we're going to have to farm, harvest, and like I told my winemaker, well, we'll just sell off those grapes because we're not going to make wine out of this place that's going to be of the quality commensurate with all the other wines. So, in fact, I felt like I was throwing $5,000 away, even though it was it's nothing cheap amount to pay for a 2.5 acre vineyard. So anyway, harvest of 2007 comes along. We harvest the grapes. I'm there. I go off back to California, and I'm speaking to my winemaker, Marucha, and she says, "Wait till you taste this wine from El Mont." And I say, I'm on the phone. I say, "El Mont, what are you talking about?" And she says, "Oh, that's the name we gave that vineyard at the base of the mountain. El Mont means the mountain in Catalan. That's the name we gave that vineyard that you bought." And I said, "Marucha, what are you talking about? We're going to get rid of that. What are you talking about wine from that vineyard?" He says, no, you got to try it. I said, "Look, Marucha, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but there's no way we're going to make a wine from that site that's any good." So we go on to talk about the other vineyards and the other wines, and I kind of forget about it. A couple months later, I show up at the winery to start tasting, to go through the wines in early February. And, whenever I go to the winery, the first order of business is I get together with the vineyard manager and his assistant, and we talk about soccer, because I come from Madrid and they're Barcelona fans. So we have this very intense rivalry. So we're talking about always start talking about who's doing well and who's doing lousy. And Marucha comes up to me and says, when should we start tasting the wine? I said, "No, go ahead. Go grab the first wine. We'll start tasting." I continue talking, and she hands me a glass, and I'm involved in this conversation, and I take a smell of it, go, wow, La Viñeta. La Viñeta is the name that we give that 135-year-old vineyard, which we consider our top vineyard. And God, La Viñeta smells amazing this year. And she looks at me and she says, it's not La Viñeta, it's El Monte. And just when you think you know everything there is to know, something comes and slaps you in the face and reminds you how much you have to still learn. And for me, that was that life lesson. It's become one of our favorite vineyards and one of the favorite wines that we make at the winery. And nobody would have thought that that site would have made anything except ordinary wine, and it actually makes extraordinary wine. So with that, we make about 120 cases of that a year. So to give you an idea, 120 cases, so that's about 60 cases from each. We have about 2.5 acres. So we get about 3/4 of a ton per acre from that vineyard. Now, to put that into perspective, a vineyard like Opus One in Napa, Opus One gets between 4 and 5 tons to the acre. So it gives you an idea. These vineyards are not irrigated and they produce very little fruit, but that very little is incredibly intense. And it has this incredible sense of minerality and sense of place that very few wines in the world have. So everything is hand harvested. And because it's on these steep slopes, in California, to give you an idea, it takes about half an hour to pick about a ton of fruit. Here at El Monte, because no machines can go up and down that slope, it takes us 5 hours to pick that same ton of grapes. So it is a labor of a lot of love that goes into that wine. So, but here it's interesting when you taste the Arels, the Grenache from Monsanto, typical, lots of fruit, lots of unctuous, jammy, upfront fruit, and then you go to the El Monte, where you have a completely different set of smells and tastes, more about earth and leather and minerals with incredible intensity. And that's a wine, the El Monte is from 2010. So we actually keep it, first we age it for about 2 years in new barrels, new French barrels, and then we hold it back for 6 to 7 years in bottle before we release it.
Emmanuel, you're frozen again.
Revealed itself.
You're good now. You're good.
I'm sorry?
You're good. You were frozen for a little bit. Are you there? Emmanuel? We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So,
Perfect.
okay. So any questions I can entertain, or you should know everything you even wanted to know about Monsanto by now. Well, I want to thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the wines. And I'll look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks and telling you about the Pinot Noirs and wines that I make in California under Mura.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Marty, do you have any questions?
No, where is all this wine? Does he sell it in North America, or it's all in Spain?
Emmanuel, did you get that?
No, can you hear me?
Emmanuel,
Hello?
did you hear the question?
Yes, yes. We import. we only leave about 5% of the wine in Spain that we sell in Europe. The rest is brought to the United States, and it's sold through our Mura distribution channels.
So how many, between all your wineries, how many cases of wine would you sell in a regular year or an average year?
We make about, in Spain, we make about 3,500 cases. So very small, between about 8 different wines. So a very small amount. I mean, that might sound like a lot, but in wine speak, anything below 20,000 cases is considered boutique or artisanal. So,
No, the quality sounds amazing.
well, thank you. Thank you. I hope you have a chance to try them sometime, Marty.
I'm going to try and find it, and I will try it. And thank you for everything. Very interesting.
Well, thank you. Thank you for listening in today.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
And Rita, I look forward to seeing you. Next time
Absolutely.
I'm out there, I have a debt to Jennifer to do a winemaker dinner there. So when this whole craziness is over, you will see me there.
It will be such a pleasure to see you again here. So whenever you can come, please do. And please stay.
I will definitely. Looking forward to it.
And we're going to enjoy the tasting tonight when my kids can get on, because they all have the wines as well. So we'll.
Oh, good. Oh,
yeah,
good.
One in
Good.
New York and one also here in Florida.
Ah, great, great. Well,
Okay.
I hope you enjoy them.
We will, I'm sure. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Everybody good?
Yeah. Thanks, guys. I really enjoyed it. Take care.
You
Take
too.
care.
Bye, Emmanuel.
Okay.
Thank you, Emmanuel.
Bye.
See you. I don't know when, but I'll see you sometime.
Marty, we
Yeah.
have the wine here, so we could always send it to you, or we can just reserve it for you. So when you do come here, you'll have it.
You could actually email the wine list. I'd be interested.
Okay, we'll do that.
Okay, and when I get there, I'm sure you'll join me for a glass of wine. Okay,
Terrific.
great.
Okay.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Everybody be safe.
Take care.
safe.
Be safe.
Bye.
Bye.